McDonnell and Jenny Manson.
Are you waiting? Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This meeting is taking place at a very exciting time for the Labour Party. We've just had an excellent conference in Liverpool. There's a possibility of a general election at any time soon. It is a critical time, and we all need to be ready to unite behind our leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and to work together, with the emphasis on together, to deliver a principled manifesto at the next election, whenever that happens. So it's lovely to welcome you all, and it's good to see such a fine attendance. But now I'd like to move on to the direct introduction. So we're very pleased to welcome John McDonnell. John is the MP for Hayes and Harlington and the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was, as many of you, all of you I think will know, Chair of Finance at the GLE before its unfortunate abolition. And importantly for tonight, since becoming Shadow Chancellor, he's been heading up the development of Labour's new economic programme. So he will be with Jenny, in conversation with Jenny Manson. Jenny, as many of you will know, has been an active member of the Labour Party for many years after a career as a councillor, chair of Barnet Carers, a tax inspector, and many other things. Well, this meeting has been arranged as a conversation between John McDonnell and Jenny for the purpose of discussing many aspects of Labour Party policy, with a particular emphasis on economic policy. And I'm sure, though I don't know for certain, they will be discussing a wide range of topics from right across the political spectrum, concentrating again on the development of economic policy. But it's going to include, I'm sure, industrial strategy, housing, social policy, public sector funding, and I guess, probably, our policy towards Europe. Well, the first part of the meeting will consist of a conversation between John and Jenny. This will be followed by an opportunity for a number of topical questions from the audience. Then, after a further period of conversation, we will take open questions from the floor. So I was just asked a couple of business matters. In case it hasn't been announced, there are toilets at that end of the room beyond the doors. And I'd like to point out there should be no filming during the session, apart from the official filmer. Okay, so without further ado, can I hand over to our guests? Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, welcome very much to you. And this is the first thing I've enjoyed in days, because now I've got control of what we do. I've had a campaign team who are wonderful, giving me multiple instructions, but the only thing they left completely to me is what John and I talk about. And I've remembered now that when I first left university, I really wanted to be a journalist on the BBC, and this is my job now. I am going to interview Mr. McDonnell. And when John and I spoke once, he says something like, "I can never stop you talking, Jenny." So this time, I'm not going to be able to stop John talking. I won't stop him, but slightly different to what was announced. Yes, we're going to stop for questions and answers at the end, but in the middle, when we talk about cuts, I want to ask 3 people who I've asked in advance to say something about one or other aspect of the cuts and how it's affected a particular part of the community. So, John, why did you want to be an MP originally?
Okay, can I first of all thank Ian for that performance?
Yeah, absolutely.
This isn't where the magical money tree came from. But he's given me some ideas. Okay, I never wanted to be an MP. Okay, well, I was, just very quickly, because it's, when I left school, I hadn't done particularly well at my A-levels, and I went on the shop floor, worked on the shop floor for a number of years in production. I made beds, I made hamburgers. I haven't tasted one since. And I worked in TVs, which was making TVs. And I used to carry, on 12-hour shifts, a glass TV from that end to maybe to where that speaker is over there. put the dots on the TV, expose them to ultraviolet lighting, and my job title was exposer. Now you try and travel abroad with that on your passport. Anyway, at that point in time, my then wife said, look, you need to go back to... And I went to, like a lot of working class kids really, I went to Burnley Tech and did my A-levels again at night school in a year, and then went to university at Brunel. And the reason I went to Brunel is because it was a sandwich course. You could work for 6 months and study for 6 months, and it was just ideal for me. And I was married then, we had children and all the rest. But when at Brunel, I did recent history, which was largely economic history, politics and government, and trained by civil servants. And everyone in my year wanted to be either a politician or a trade union organiser. And I wanted to be the manager of the co-op. Seriously, I was going to transform the co-op into the most effective organisation to demonstrate I was really hung up on Robert-owned principles. I'd read it all, studied it, etc. And I couldn't get a job. I think I must have overpowered them with my ideas for the co-op for the future. And so then, strangely enough, a job came up with the National Union of Mine Workers, and I went for it. It was assistant head of the social insurance department. There was only the head, me, and a PA, and that was it. I was appointed by, some of you may remember these names, Lawrence Daly and Mick McGarhy and Joe Gormley. Actually working class intellectuals, really extremely well read people. Got appointed there, then went to the TUC, and then I went on the GLC. And what happened on the GLC, this is all accident, I'll be quick. I was going to be the agent for my friend who was going to be the candidate for the GLC in our area. And he then got elected to his trade union executive, and so within months of the election he pulled out. And it's like anything else. Most of you in the room have been in this situation. You get volunteered. Everyone steps backwards, don't they, when you're... So then I got on the GLC, and within 12 months I then chair of finance on the GLC, etc. So eventually, after being on the GLC, etc., and then going back into local government as an officer, eventually the local constituency then said, would I run for Parliament? And that was it, really. And I stood in 92, and I lost by 54 votes to a Tory. I know every one of them. I visit them on a regular basis on the basis of their guilt. And then, literally, we lost in 92 on the Thursday. On the Saturday, we were out campaigning again. And then in 97, we won the seat back from the Conservatives and then held it ever since and increased the majority. And I just say in Parliament, there are lots of people who come to Parliament relatively young, or who have sort of on the back of an envelope in their pockets, MP by such an age, Minister by such an age, Prime Minister by such and such an age. And I just say to people, actually, it isn't a career. It is not a career. If anything, it sounds a bit pompous, this, but if anything, it's more of a vocation than a career. You're there to do good, to change the world, etc. And as soon as you allow career opportunity to overcome that commitment and principle, that's where we get lost. And I think actually this new... I think if you look around the Parliamentary Labour Party, I think that's what the PLP is all about. And we've got a Parliamentary Labour Party at the moment. If you look at the work they do in their constituencies, it's phenomenal. And the work that they're doing in Parliament, holding this government to account. And we might have different sort of political views on particular issues, but we're bound together, I think, now by that cause about transforming society. And I'm just really proud. And I'm proud to be an MP. I'm proud to be... I've lived in my community 40 years and represented it for the last 20-odd years, and then on the GLC, etc. I go to work on the bus in the morning. I get lots of banter. My office say, please don't walk through the town centre. You pick up too much casework and all that sort of thing. We're thinking about getting a disguise. But I just love it. I love it. But it's not a career. We've got to say to people, when we select you, this isn't about a career. This is about, if anything, a vocation. And the other thing as well, I'm rabbiting on, but what I'm saying to everyone now is we must not think that when we go into government, we're electing this group of MPs to just go off and do it for us. That'll never work. When we go into government next time, we all go into government. And we're all part of that delivery as well as the development of ideas as well.
Thank you. You've answered my second question too, which was going to be, why do you still want to be an MP?
On that though,
yeah.
Just because it was interesting, I was in the tea rooms today talking to someone. I tell you what, and this is happening right the way across our communities really, we're coming back from our constituencies and going into Parliament, And take my area, Hayes and Harlington, we've discussed this before, Jenny, working class, multicultural community. And I'll keep reminding people, tonight I will have people sleeping in the parks and near the canal. I'll have families in sheds and garages rented out to them. I'll have families in overcrowded conditions that we've never seen before since the Second World War in our community. And we'll have people we've gone in my constituency office. My constituency office is run by a saint called Helen Loader. And she is a saint. We have gone to open door policy now, 4 days a week, where anyone can turn up and we'll deal with them. If I'm there, I'll deal with them. If they want to see me later, we'll make an appointment or a home visit. And with sanctions and what's happening on the benefit system, we're dealing with people in abject poverty at the moment. And then kids who are coming home from school in the most overcrowded conditions, the teenagers nowhere to be at home, so they're forced out on the street, then they're prone to gangs, etc. So why do you want to stay an MP? Because I'm not willing to live in a society like that. I want to absolutely transform it, and that's what our passion is, isn't it? That's our mission, basically.
Thank you. I want this to be a very positive event too, but I've just got 2 questions for you, John, about what I think the Labour Party did wrong in the early years after the recession. And the first one is, why did Labour seem to accept that it was our fault, the 2008 recession? I didn't hear enough spokespeople saying, no, we did not overspend, no, if we did, recessions are not caused by government overspending, they were caused by a problem in America. It seemed, and I did hear anecdotally, that one senior Labour leader of the past, I won't name him, gave advice that if we try to defend ourselves, we look weak.
I think it's interesting. There was a thing on Radio 4 last Saturday, which was about the anniversary of the crash. And they interviewed at length Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, and there was a short interview from 10 years ago with me as well. We need to recognise what Gordon Brown did at the time. He actually did lead the world in bringing about an intervention in the economy that prevented a recession going into a depression. There's no doubt about that. The only disagreement I had with them was in rescuing the banks. My view then was nationalise to stabilise. And that's what we did. I called for it in Parliament, and then a few weeks later there were some nationalisations. And Alistair Darling had a dry sense of humour. And when I got up to say, well, I'm pleased you've now followed my advice to nationalise the banks, he said, well, John, you've been calling for it for 30 years. You're bound to get it right once, you know. But actually, if you look at the interview in the programme and elsewhere, I was saying we intervened in the financial sector, etc., but actually we didn't take control of the financial sector in a way which benefited everyone. So our intervention on QE, for example, meant assets rose in value, and the bankers walked away, not laughing all the way to bank, but actually came away with quite significant wealth enhanced. And we didn't when we took control of the banks, actually we didn't actually take control of elements of the boards to direct it. So I think Gordon Brown, his intervention, his global intervention, to be frank, saved us from a depression, but I think we could have done it in different ways and better. And then what happened when Gordon went, 2010 in particular, there was almost a gap. We were fighting for a new leadership and a new leadership being elected, etc. And in that opportunity, in that period when we should have been challenging the myth of what happened, there was a sort of a vacuum that didn't happen. And then, unfortunately, I think there was still an element of hegemony about neoliberalism, and therefore it wasn't sufficiently challenged. And it's the point we keep on saying now. The deficit was caused by the crisis, not the deficit causing the crisis. And there were some of us saying that, but we never got the message across effectively. No. And even now, it's still worth challenging in the debate.
I completely agree. Thank you. The other grievance of mine, so to speak, was how is it ever possible that the Labour Party, before you and Mr. Corbyn were in charge, accepted a programme of austerity at all? Why would the poor have to pay for what happened in the recession?
Yeah, that was the debate, I think, that took Jeremy into the leadership, because there was a sort of I think what people called it in the media and elsewhere, sort of austerity light within the Labour Party, insufficiently radical to understand what that meant for working people. And I think what Jeremy basically said is that, can you remember that slogan in the first leadership election which we were using, which was austerity is a political choice, it's not an economic necessity. And I think that bit home, and people understood it then, and it was a political choice. And I think I used it in my speech this conference as well, where, you know, what the Tories were all about was basically saying those people who caused the crisis, the bankers, the speculators, will not be the ones who pay for it. And the ones who will be paid for it for the rest of society. And I mean the rest of society, every strata basically, apart from the super rich and the corporations. And I think that Jeremy got that message across in the first leadership campaign, and that's what consolidated the support that got him the leadership. And then if you remember those key votes, can you remember the votes around the welfare bill? And I did that. My usual moderate style, I said I'd swim through vomit rather than vote for this thing. I know. Yeah. My literary style is being reined back at the moment. Jeremy said no jokes. Okay, but there were people, and Andy Burnham is the tragic figure in all this, because actually Andy Burnham, when he went into the leadership election, was the favourite to win. And then he took the decision that they would abstain on welfare rather than vote against. And I think that was a crisis of conscience for a lot of people, that issue. And that's what demonstrated that Jeremy was on a completely different agenda, and that actually a proper analysis of the world as well.
Yes.
And I don't think people understood the full implications of what the Tories were planning as well. I'm not being arrogant about it, but some of my staff pulled out an interview I did. And I actually said way back in 2008, when the crisis hit and they were doing QE and elsewhere and other matters, that this will be paid for over time by either increases in taxes or cuts. And that's exactly what's happening. And the increases in taxes were largely, if you remember when the Tories came in, they promised no increase in VAT. Then they whacked VAT up, and that's a regressive tax for working people. And then the cuts really started to roll out. And I think people didn't understand either the depth of the crisis and therefore what austerity would mean in the long run. And I think the harshness of austerity, this human suffering that's been taking place. Liverpool University, I got all the disability groups together 3 weeks ago, and we had a discussion about where we're going from here on UC, work capability assessments, etc. Liverpool University were there and did a presentation. And this is the campaign we've been waging for years, Jeremy and I, way back back to 2010 virtually. And they did an analysis of the increase in suicides as a result of impact of welfare benefit cuts.
Yes, well, I'm going to get somebody to talk about cuts in a second. And thank you, the effect. And I was going to say something else. There was a myth, wasn't there, that some of these cuts weren't going to hurt anybody, because there was all this waste in the public sector. And I can see several friends of mine from the public sector. We don't get everything right, but there is not a lot of waste. This idea, this myth that you're going to be able to cut and there'll be no effect. So could I ask first perhaps Keith Burstein to say something about the cuts to the arts?
No, Keith.
A microphone? Sorry.
I went to see this man's opera. It was superb. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Yes, I'm guilty of writing a couple of operas that are politically controversial. And so I know what it's like to be on the wrong end of the media and all those controversies. I think the arts have to be placed right at the heart of an incoming Labour government. And I think from what I've heard, they are going to be. Because creativity in society is at the core of the quality of the society we inhabit. Just to give an anecdote about that, my mother was a peripatetic violin teacher. I knew the word peripatetic when I was about 8. And in Brighton, before it was Brighton and Hove, and she used to go around teaching hundreds of children in schools. And there was a whole army of teachers like her, employed in the state sector. That really is crucial to the future development and happiness of our world, and that's gone, I think, from what anecdotal knowledge I have. I don't think that sort of teaching really exists anymore. So I think it's vital. Just very quickly to say, the other quote that comes to my mind is Shelley, who said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
Yeah.
And so that places cultural creativity at the heart of the moral, social, ethical values in our society, but also creativity should be also valued in all fields of our life, in science, and it's at the heart of what it is to be human.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
And Ida, are you going to be happy to stand? Ida is going to talk a bit about the plight of asylum seekers. Now, as she and I said at the beginning, there's nothing to cut in that area, but this has been one of my lifetime concerns for refugees. And at the moment, if you get any benefit at all, you're for some reason expected to live on a much lower percentage of the full benefit. And my husband and I, he's sitting over there, have supported a young woman through the long period when she had no benefit at all. The idea that there was huge amount of money being washed towards people who are asylum seekers. So, Ida, would you mind saying a word about that? Thank you. Any water? Yes, any water.
I work with refugee and asylum seekers for all my professional life, all my life. The cut is it not working?
Yes.
Is it that better?
Yes, great, thank you.
The cut, I think, as Jenny says, there is not much to cut. If people are asylums, if the people get their refugee status, they have their benefit like any other unemployed people. But if they're asylum seekers, they're sent to the camp or hostel, which the government give them voucher to go and get their need from the shops. And they can't get certain things with those vouchers. Those, for example, we know the patients who come to us who have been tortured severely and traumatized, and they are in need of having their cigarette. They take their food voucher and sell it. I saw them in Camden myself. I couldn't believe it. They sell the voucher, which is supposed to be 40, I think, if I remember rightly. They sell it for £10 to get cigarette, and they don't eat. That is one aspect. The other aspect of the asylum seekers whose application was rejected, they're not entitled to any benefit or any housing or anything. We have a patient who brought by very helpful community police to our center because she was raped in the park by the gang and was crying, and these community police find them, couldn't understand what she was saying and why she was crying. They brought her to the center and we start doing assessment and try to help her. There are a lot of cases. We have a case, for example, it was in the newspaper called Mrs. and Baby G, who were in the system between when people are asylum seekers, if they have a child or if they are the victim of domestic violence, they are under because of child protection or the social services, is not like the adult. And when they get the refugee status, immediately social service responsibility is released, and that person will be responsible to carry on their own issue. This woman who didn't speak any English, I have a child, a girl of 6 years old, and a baby of 8 months old. Her benefit and everything cut off because she's got her refugee status accepted, which usually should be very happy news. But because she couldn't do anything, she left. It was in Westminster, heart of the wealth in London. Left in the house, couldn't eat or anything. The child will die, the little child. And she called the hospital come, they called the police, they arrest the woman. In the way taking her to the police station, she died. Then it was the result was hunger. There is a lot of issue about asylum. I'm not going to say one, but it's not just a cut. There is a lot of things is going on, and this country can be better to people. One of the best things I think we can do is stop attacking other people's country. Then people don't come here.
what I've often told people, very boringly though, the thing I nearly left the Labour Party, I've been a member since I was a student, was I thought the disdain with which people talked about asylum seekers. There used to be quite a craze, I don't know if you remember, they've got a Rolls Royce round the back of the house, that sort of stuff. We must stop that language forever, and I hope deal with some of the things you describe. And sorry, finally, Pam, who is going to speak about mental health cases.
Right. My name is Pam Blakelock, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I was working at the Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital until 2015 as an honorary worker. Yesterday was World Mental Health Day, and the theme for this year's World Mental Health Day is young people and mental health in a changing world. According to the World Health Organization, half of all mental illness begins by the age of 14, but most cases go undetected and untreated. And the Mental Health Foundation states that 2 in 3 people report having experienced a mental health problem during their lifetime. So I live and work in Southwark, and our neighbouring borough was Lewisham, and this year Lewisham Borough Council proposed cutting £150,000 from the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, which is called CAMS. Now, this is partly because that some of the funding for the adolescent service, although it's mainly NHS, a lot comes also to the local councils. And the funding for local councils has been so massively cut, they're unable to keep basic services going. Anyway, under the leadership of one of the Lewisham Hospital paediatric doctors, Dr. Tony O'Sullivan, a massive campaign was launched, lobbying every single councillor. And in the end, the council decided to postpone for 2 years these cuts. Now, that would have been 150 would have been, at least 3 psychotherapist posts gone, and a massive reduction in a already strained service. So I'm in the Southwark Labour Party, Dulwich and West Norwood, and my local Labour Party set up a campaign with psychiatrists from the Maudsley Hospital to make sure that Southwark Council also did not attempt the same cuts. At the moment, we have assurances, but we recognise the enormous pressure on councils to cut these basic services. The figures are really shocking. The figures from the Freedom of Information process, we found that only 1/3 of young people needing treatment were eligible, and of these, actually only 19% actually received treatment. And as we all know, government announcements of more money barely touch the sides. Then the other thing I want to say is that this campaign in Lewisham, which was partially successful to oppose these cuts for 2 years, was organised by Keep Our National Health Public. And I urge you all to go on your computer and join up. And I just want to add one more thing. Behind this, there are really secret government moves to further privatise the NHS. And they've changed the names of their new processes from sustainability and transformation plans, STPs, to ACOs, accountable care organisations, and now they've morphed into integrated care providers. So some health professionals launched a judicial review, crowdfunded. They lost most of it. They were asking for consultation, and now they're asking. asking for assurances that these new processes do not open all these contracts even more to private investment, which will, as we know, produce worse outcomes and leave those who are most in need without the service that they need.
As you know, John, I could have thought of so many other subjects, prisons. What I wanted you to ask for now, how are we going to pay for it? Now, as you know, I used to be a tax inspector, and I can see several colleagues in the audience. We've got some very good people to advise you, but what's your plan for paying for reversing the cuts?
Okay, let me just go through these ones in particular, and I'll come back to the overall plan. With regard to culture, in every speech that Jeremy's done virtually, he's made reference to the importance of culture in our society. One of the ideas that we put in the last manifesto, if you remember, was a pupil premium so that every child could have access to learning music, the arts, etc. And what's happening at the moment, and I feel for teachers at the moment, because under a lot of pressure, teaching to the test, the pressures are on them enormously, they're working long hours as well, and a lot of those things that would be part of the curriculum are under-resourced, particularly with regard to the arts and culture and music, etc. We're going to address that within our National Education Service. On the issue of asylum seekers, let me just briefly say this. I've got 2 detention centres in my constituency, Harmondsworth and Colnbrook. Years ago, and I've been visiting over the years, but years ago there used to be just a Nissen hut with no more than about 12, at best 20 people in at any one time. Now there are 2 buildings and there's 1,000 people in there. Now what's happening there as well is at least half of them, even though detained, will be released and will go into society. And yet they're held there, and there's no limit on how long they can be held there either. And if you remember, the headlines case in my constituency a few years ago was that 83-year-old man who was taken to Hillingdon Hospital in handcuffs and died in handcuffs. There's a brutality of the regime that is unacceptable in a civilized society at the moment. In terms of what's happening on children, I just want to say this because in the autumn statement, then in the budget, we said our number 1 priority would be children's services, and we asked for the government to plug the £2 billion gap that there is in children's services. And one of the reasons for this as well is because we've now got, because of the cuts in early intervention to support families and children in particular, we've now got record numbers of children coming into care. Back to the figures that we had in the 1980s, basically. And again, it's just a false saving as well. If you cut the early interventions and then there's a family breakdown, the cost magnifies when you take children into care. I appealed to Philip Hammond on both occasions to address that, and it never happened. We'll be taking that up again in the budget speeches and the amendments that we'll seek to move to the budget. That's coming up. How do we pay for all this? Look,
mental health you wanted to mention too, did you?
Yes, exactly. Well, yesterday, I don't know whether you saw it, on Wednesday, Jeremy raised the issue of mental health in Prime Minister's questions. 5,000 mental health workers being cut, mental health nurses cut, and there was no response from the government on that. This idea that they're putting more money in, it's the point that you made, it doesn't even touch the sides really, and that's part of our investment in the NHS that will go in. But it's also local government. Local government now facing another couple of £1 billion worth of cuts, that are coming £1.7 billion worth of cuts. It's interesting, Local Government Association, which represents both Conservative and Labour administrations, are raising the issue here about actually they can't go on much longer. And it's interesting, isn't it? There's been Conservative councils, Northamptonshire and elsewhere, that are the ones that have gone bust. It just is a reflection that the whole social fabric that we thought was secure after Labour government, you never thought would ever be challenged again, actually is. And that's the issue now. I think that the social fabric of our society is at risk, and everything you thought. My generation, we thought progress would be linear, that one generation would bequeath to another a better improved standard of living, life expectancy. Life expectancy in this country is going backwards for the first time now in generations. And that linear approach to improvement in society has been broken down as a result of the last 8 years of hard austerity. That's why we need a Labour government. And the reason we need a Labour government is because we'll invest in our economy. And the way we'll invest, first of all, this is not rocket science. In the last manifesto we published, as you may know, remember the Grey Book, which was actually a costing of the manifesto. Every policy, we took a costing of it. We then looked for a funding source and identified that. I joke about it, and I repeat it time and time again. The Tories had the cheek to challenge us on that when the only figures in their manifesto were the page numbers. They never did any costings whatsoever. We had a challenge on a couple of the costings from the IFS, which we disagreed with, but it wasn't significant to our overall calculations. And we basically said this: if you want to live in a civilized society where you no longer have 5,000 people sleeping on our streets, you no longer have the appalling housing need that we've got, you no longer have people living in poverty. 4 million of our children, and rising, are living in poverty now. 2/3 of them are in families where someone's at work. What you do is you have a fair taxation system. So we said in that Grey Book, yes, we would raise income tax on the top 5%, and not even significant amounts, but it was needed. We'd reverse some, but not all, of the corporation tax cuts that have been allocated by the government. And again, you're talking about £80 billion being given away. And the interesting thing there, they said, well, if we cut corporations, increase in investment will take place. The corporations are sitting on £700 billion worth of earned income not invested. So it hasn't worked in that sense. Well, in addition to that, we said we'd tackle tax evasion, tax and avoidance, which is on an industrial scale at the moment. Look at the front page of the Daily Mirror today and see what, since Cadbury's were taken over, just how little they're paying in corporation tax at the moment. Example after example that we used. In addition to that, we said we would introduce a financial transaction tax, a Tobin tax. Some of us have been campaigning for one for years, where you eliminate some of the stamp duty anomalies within the city on shared transactions. We then said, yes, we'll reverse some of the inheritance tax cuts that have been taking place, which would benefit the wealthiest, not others. That amounted to about £49 billion worth of tax income that we would then spend on our public services. And yes, we'd ensure we establish a national education service, free at the point of need like the NHS, and that meant scrapping tuition fees and making sure education was genuinely free. We'd invest in the NHS, and yes, we would look at the National Care Service as well. All of those things were affordable within that amount. What we're now doing is, we don't know when the general election is going to come. What we're now doing is looking at that manifesto as the foundation, but then looking at other ideas that we're bringing forward. But everything that we do, we'll do exactly the same. We'll cost the policy, we'll identify a funding source, and we'll ensure that's fully consulted upon. I was at an interview at the FT today, and I've been meeting with a whole series of asset managers and banks, etc. We met Schroders the other day, we had Goldman Sachs in, etc. And we've been saying, most of the stuff that we're advocating you'll agree with, because it's about investment and growing our economy. There'll be some things you won't agree with, but if you can get us to the same objective by a different route, let me know. But it's going to happen, so get used to it. And actually what we're finding is actually by openness and transparency, and I do this bit, pardon the nothing up my sleeves. I do that bit, we're going to be completely open and transparent. You'll know what we're going to do. And actually, I've been saying to a number of them as well, we're recommending structures like a strategic investment board, where yes, the Bank of England, the Treasury, BIS will come together, but they'll also come together with business leaders and trade unions as well. So they'll be part of the decision-making in government with us. And on that basis, we have a stable approach to how we manage our economy. Finally, all through, as soon as I appointed Shadow Chancellor, and all the representations I received, but before that when I was on the backbenches, everything that we were being told is about the lack of investment, business investment stagnating in this country, lack of investment by the state, some of the lowest levels of investment in our infrastructure. So the degradation of our infrastructure, and it's road, it's rail, it's digital, it's alternative energy sources, etc., means we're progressively falling behind our competitors. And we're just not fit to meet the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution with automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. Virtually everyone was saying we need more investment. So I said, that's what we'll do. CapEx, the departmental spending, £250 billion over a 10-year programme. And I set up a national investment bank. Ideas for that? Well, they come from Germany and other countries right the way across Europe, where you then harness the resources of that national investment bank, working with the private sector, another £250 billion over a 10-year programme. Nothing untoward. Where did that 500 billion figure come from? The CBI. And that's what their recommendation is, just to get us to a position where we can compete globally. So that, in that way, a fair taxation system, investment to grow the economy, enables us to have a prosperous economy. Two factors. One is what we're saying is we want prosperity, a prosperous economy that's economically and environmentally sustainable. Difference between us and the Tories will always be this, but where that prosperity is shared by everybody. That's the objectives that we've got as we go into government. And again, I find it very difficult to find people who agree with the objective. They might disagree with some of the detail of our proposals, but what we're saying to them, just come in. There's an open door for anyone who wants to talk to us about that. Final point. Some of you will have seen this week the IPCC report in terms of climate change. There's 3 debates that we're now launching. One is a debate around inequality and impoverishment. And it's interesting, that's coming back. As I go around the city and meet these asset managers, that's coming back as an issue for them as well. No one wants to live in a society, no matter how wealthy you are, where you're stepping over a homeless person. And remember, it's only a few months ago a homeless person died outside the doors of the House of Commons. The second issue then is climate change. Because if we don't address that as a society and globally, everything else pays insignificance because we'll be wiped away. And then the third issue, and this is the point that Gordon Brown raised, he did a brilliant speech a few weeks ago. And he basically said, if you look at the global institutions that we now have, they're not fit for purpose if there's to meet up with a future crisis. And the issues he presented with, the trade wars that have been stimulated by Trump and others, the issues around climate change themselves, but also the grotesque levels of global inequality as well. So the debate we're opening up on that is that in the spring, we're asking Joe Stiglitz to introduce this. We're holding a social forum type conference, international one, where we look at the reform of the global institutions. We need a new Bretton Woods, basically, a new settlement at an international level that we can work together. Now, there are huge challenges that they're facing in the future, but I tell you, we're up for it. But what's interesting, so is everyone else I'm talking to, and certainly the new generation that's coming through is up for it.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at my chairman over there. I've got 3 quick questions now, because then we've got to have some time for question and answer. Okay, the first one's very important to be quick, but in Barnet we have a very acute housing crisis, as you know, John, as we do in the whole of the country, particularly the southeast. Can you tell me what you plan differently from what Mrs May seemed to be offering the other day?
We're going to resort, It's all well and good saying now that they'll allow local authorities to resort to borrow, etc. That was our policy we've had for ages. But what we're also saying, we will resource that. So from the Capital Transformation Fund, the National Transformation Fund, we will resource housing development. Our target is 1 million homes. And John Healy has said over a 10-year period, 1 million that will be proper council housing, etc., that people can afford. The issue for me in areas like Barnet's the same in my area. We've got to build, we've got to renovate, and I've also opened up the debate around that Sadiq Khan has as well, around it takes us time to build those homes. In the meantime, there'll be large numbers of people still in the private rented sector, so we've got to ensure they get proper rights and security. But in addition to that, I think the debate around rental controls in some areas has got to be opened up now. And people think this is revolutionary. We used to have fair rents in this country. I can remember them because we used to have the local authority would establish a fair rent. If you look at other European capital cities, they're doing exactly the same thing. And it could be an issue that in some areas you put on the agenda as effective. And I think it should be, my own view, it should be one of those issues that has to be addressed.
Thank you. Okay, the next one's difficult to answer quickly. But how will Brexit affect our plans?
Look, in terms of what Mrs May is negotiating at the moment, this is my prediction, I might be wrong. I think we meet with Barnier and the others on a regular basis, and we've established a good working relationship. I think what will happen is our European partners will provide Theresa May with something to come back. It will be a fudge. And by the sound of it, it'll be very similar to some of the things we've been saying, like a customs union. But it'll be a customs union dressed up in other language. But one of the things they're saying is a customs union for a limited period of time. It won't give us the access to the single market on the scale that we want. And my worry is that other factor that Keir has particularly emphasised. What will be at risk is all that European legislation that protects us in terms of environment and wages and conditions, etc. So it won't be a deal, I don't think, that we can accept. And the FT were asking me today, and I said, look, she'll try and portray herself as Churchillian. It's more likely to be more of a Neville Chamberlain, you know, peace in our time, which won't last very long. And then what will happen is we won't be able to vote for it. I don't know what some of the Tories are going to do. We'll see what she comes back with. But it's a fudge like that. It will just increase the uncertainty and insecurity within our economy. We'll still have business investors who are saying, well, we can't predict what's going to happen more after 18 months or something like that. And I think it'll be the worst of all worlds. If we take over after that, to be frank, it means actually the restructuring of the economy that we need to do becomes more urgent. And the investment becomes more urgent. The way in which we restructure so we can get a prosperity that's shared by everyone becomes more urgent. So we'll meet the challenge, whatever we pick up with. But look, I don't know whether there'll be a general election or not. I'm a pessimist. I think they're going to cling on to office. They're not in power. We're on one-line whips all the time at the moment because there's no legislation going through. The only thing that might change is the fact that actually the Tories hate each other more than they hate us at the moment. So that instability may mean that we'll drift into a general election, but it could well be a bit of a John Major type thing where they go out with a whimper rather than a bang. There's people on the Tory backbenchers who will push for a no deal, which will be cataclysmic as far as I can see. But we'll do our best and protect the country's interests.
Okay, final question. What are you looking forward to most as Chancellor?
Okay. Well, I am. So Ed Miliband came up to me in the lobby. He won't mind me telling you this. A few months ago, and I must have been looking tired or something. He said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "I'm having the time of my life." Because we're preparing for government. And we're preparing for government to transform the world. You know, you don't come into the Labour Party, do you, just to maintain the status quo. You come into the Labour Party to transform society, and that's what we're going to do, basically.
Okay, I'm sorry we're running a little bit late. I think it was the trouble in the streets that's caused it to be a bit longer. But we will aim to finish at 10 minutes' time.
Yeah. Maybe a bit longer.
No, plenty.
Okay.
Our guests have very kindly offered to answer some questions from the floor. So we'd like to make sure that this remains a comedy and friendly event. It's been quite clear that we're not, this isn't a meeting about anti-Semitism, about Israel or about Palestine. We're here to discuss aspects of Labour Party policy and economic policy in general. So with that proviso, that if you persist in being difficult or unruly, your microphone will be taken away and you'll be removed. So with that forewarning...
I think he's referring to me.
We'd just like everybody to be to carry on as best we can. Okay, I'll take a few questions. This lady over here, the lady over on my right. The lady?
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Emily and I'm a student at LSE. Finchley and Golders Green is an area that appears very economically comfortable, but our town centres and small businesses are struggling. We need a Labour MP to unite our constituency against the Tories and stop these crippling cuts. We need someone to build the trust we need across this community to pave the way back for our party. I want to ask, how can a divisive figure do this and assure me as a Jewish Labour member that my feelings will be heard and valued?
I think it's a really valid question because what we need at the moment is healing voices, people who will build a consensus. Now, I've known Jenny a number of years. I think she could be that person, and we need to ensure all of us become healing voices now. Recognizing where there are differences, those differences are not irresolvable. They can be talked through, and I think in doing that by mutual respect for different views as well, we come out of it stronger. And I went through the Northern Ireland peace process. My family's Irish and all the rest of it, and I just think, and again, it's what Tony. Actually, this is the good thing about what Tony Blair did. Is he brought people together. And people shared their strong views and then realised for the common good, by being honest about those views, they could resolve their differences. And again, I praise Tony Blair for that. I think he would have gone down in history around the Northern Ireland peace process if we hadn't had the nightmare of Iraq. But I think it's that sort of person we want, and I think Jenny is that sort of person given the chance. So I think we need to, as I say, we need healing voices now.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Can we take another question from the front? That gentleman. Yeah.
Wait for the microphone.
Thanks very much, sir. I never knew Mr. McDonnell that we shared the same university like Brunel, because when I left Ruskin College, I did a master's degree at Brunel University. Thanks very much for being a comrade and alumni, as I call it. Sorry, but the black man that you see here in front of you, British that I am requesting, in the light of the black history, and of which I read today in the newspaper, that black history, colonialism, slavery is going to be compulsory in the new Labour government by no other than Jeremy Corbyn. Are you in a cahoot? Are you completely conspirators in this newly found system of education by which, when Blair, thank you very much, when he's talking about education, I think it's a very, very fine thing to do, because without education, we are nothing. We cannot do anything ourselves. If we don't know our past, neither can we know our future and our present either. So another point I want to make, I think it is the gentleman who was talking about the arts. The arts, actually, I think the arts of which traditionally we have told about the tragedies and the comedies are no art as far as I'm concerned. I am listening to the Radio 4 daily when you talk about comedies, paraphrazation of a character, and political intimidation, and the personal paraphrazation is no art whatsoever. It's not creative, it is destruction. Please cease to do that on Radio 4 and elsewhere. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. On the first point, Black History Month, Jeremy was in Bristol today and has announced that will be, again, I think he's announced a new initiative around an Black History Month trust that will fund. Way back, I know this is archaeology, but that's because I'm so old, but when I was Chair of Finance on the GLC, we funded Black History Month. And you can imagine what the Evening Standard did. It was just horrendous. Stephen's here. It was horrendous, wasn't it? The backlash we got and how this was loony left and all that sort of thing. It's now mainstream. And the reason we funded it is because a group of people from the BAME community came along and said, actually, our contribution to society has been ignored. How can we explain to people what our contribution was? And so Black History was founded, and it was incredibly successful. A number of Conservative councils now continue that on, but a number of them have actually said, well, we're merging this into a general diversity or whatever. Well, actually, I think that approach doesn't recognise the wide range of cultures that we have in London. I'm, as I say, Irish background. We have St. Patrick's Day. In fact, it's become St. Patrick's Month at the moment. But again, the Asian community within my community, and I've got a large Somali community, all of them now are saying, we're part of this society, but we also want to celebrate our culture. And that's why Black history is so important. With regard to the comical denigration of politicians on Radio 4 and all the rest of it, I actually think they get me perfectly right. And my wife says when she hears it, she thinks I'm being interviewed rather than being set up.
Are you?
Okay, can we take another question? Tirza?
Hi, I'm Tirza, and apart from being a Labour member... Oh, sorry, I don't shout loud enough. Tirza from Labour Finchley and Golders Green, and also from Barnet Alliance for Public Services. And I want to commend and thank John and Jeremy, who are the only MPs that stood with us in picket lines with Barnet Unison, with us in Barnet Alliance in the famous Barnet Spring March, which was in a blizzard of snow and sleet.
Oh, hey.
I have a photo of you on the bus in the snow.
It wasn't helped by having an open-top bus?
Which we knew afterwards. So we are now in a stage where we think we have a chance to finally kick out Capita of Barnet. Capita's, well, I need all your hands, rather than clapping now, signing the petition to kick out Capita. If we will get enough signatures from Barnet residents on this petition, we have a chance to speak in the council and convince them, because they are actually considering whether to bring back in-house some or all the services.
Tirza,
But
do you have a question?
My question, I'm sorry. My question is, can you legislate to protect public services from privatization, from being outsourced under the EU regulations, certainly within the EU, and I'm not sure what will happen if we will leave. And second question is, how are you going to support Jenny, as hopefully our next MP, in helping, in pushing the council to bring services in-house and to be able to sustain them in-house?
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny.
And John, I want to say something too, but you go first.
Capita is a classic example of what happens on outsourcing and privatisation, and what's happened in Barnet has been a disgrace. But what's interesting, in all those marches and demonstrations and picket lines with John Burgess and others from Unison, everything that Unison has said would happen, has happened. And that includes the prosecutions for corruption that have gone on as well. The fraud that's taken place is appalling. What Jeremy has said is very, very clear. We're ending privatisation. There will be an in-house preference. We'll be developing direct labour as well, as much as we possibly can. But the key issue then is making sure local government local councils have proper funding. We're now doing a review of the financial base for local government, and again we're looking at a whole range of measures on that. There'll be consultation about it, but I just say to Labour councillors, there's heroes and heroines out there that have done their best they possibly could to protect their local communities in the most difficult circumstances, and also some of the trade union campaigns, and Barnet has been a model example of some of the campaign that's gone on, and I congratulate both the Labour councillors and also the trade unionists and community representatives that have done that. All through that period, the exposure of the role of Capita has been important, because it's given confidence to other people as well. With regard to the European legislation, look, I get this a lot of times, these restrictions on state aid or in competition, etc. There are some restrictions, but what's interesting, I chaired the group of Labour MPs on the steel industry when steel was under attack, going through difficult periods. And the government was saying, well, we can't intervene, etc., because of European legislation. Then we simply sent our people around Europe, and you saw that there was state intervention in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. And what's been happening here is often for political will, but also the civil services, the most narrowest definition of the rules, of regulations of the EU to prevent us doing that, which other countries don't seem to have those same restrictions on it. So I don't accept that. There's issues around competition law. I think, again, that even if we were still within the EU, we'd be able to ensure that it didn't impact upon the implementation of our manifesto. But whatever happens after Brexit, because that's one of the things that Theresa May has said to the European Union, if you remember, they will maintain the issue, the legislation or the regulations on state aid. That's because they're opposed to the state intervening in any way within the economy itself. I think when we go into government, we won't be hidebound by that. The regulations that are there will be able to work with and effectively implement our manifesto anyway. But it's the same in the health service. Every meeting I do at health workers, of course they're saying we want more funding. Of course they want proper pay and all the rest of it. But one of the key things, almost top of the agenda, do not pour money into the front door and let it go out the back door in privatisation into the pockets of profiteers.
I just wanted to say one thing, which is perhaps slightly off-key to some people. In some ways, however badly Capita did this particular thing, I don't think we should be blaming the Capita people, the staff.
No.
And I think too much of that happens. The blame for all this, and I remember it well in the revenue days, when the whole concept of outsourcing started. The fault is in government and local authorities falling for this outsourcing thing. The actual companies who do it sometimes are perfectly decent staff, and I just think we have to make sure that we attack the right people. Capita does seem to have a problem with supervision, but I was told by one woman who was a friend who was extremely upset when Capita took over a care home, and although they made cuts, they were forced to. The actual staff was sweet and nice, so we mustn't turn it into the attack on the wrong people.
Should we just take one last question from the gentleman in the middle, who's had his hand up the whole time?
Shout.
Hello? Okay. Okay. John, it was good to hear that you are prepared to meet some bankers. I actually work for an American investment bank in the city.
They're the only people I seem to be meeting at the moment.
But I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, perhaps, than the people you've met. Taxation, I'm concerned about the question that Jenny raised about how we spend the money and how we finance our program. And there are a lot of misconceptions about taxation and spending fiscal operations. Mm. So taxation is a reserve drain, it's not a reserve add. So it's just a balance sheet operation. When we pay our taxes, all that happens is our account is balanced down to zero. Our liability is extinguished and our account is zero. We do not need taxes in order to spend. The government spent £435 billion to purchase government bonds from the banks, like mine, okay? And they didn't raise a penny in tax, and they didn't borrow a cent from anyone. Where did they get the £435 billion from, and why are they now trying to sell those bonds on the open market?
Thank you.
Okay.
Sounds like one for you.
It is. This is the debate around QE, quantitative easing. When the crisis occurred, one of the mechanisms, normally the normal Keynesian response to a crisis like that is to drop interest rates as fast as possible. And if you look at what's happening in the debate then, I thought the government was slow in dropping the interest rates. That's the first thing. The second thing they came up with is, having done that, they then used quantitative easing as much as possible. In my view, the QE that was used then was effective in stabilising the financial system, but wasn't effective in the long term of getting the benefits for the wider community itself. This issue is around, do you need taxes, or are you just to create wealth or to create money itself? What we've done is we've taken a balanced view of all of this. We've introduced a fiscal rule that's been developed by Simon Wren-Lewis, one of our key advisors, in which we've said, actually, yes, the deficit does matter. Debt does matter. The relationship between debt and GDP, that ratio does matter, because it matters in terms of the confidence of the rest of the world in regard to what we're doing in this country itself. So our fiscal rule is flexible. Basically, it means we've said we will not borrow for day-to-day expenditure. We will balance the deficit over a period of time, be a rolling 5-year program. And that, yes, if interest rates go to what they call the lower bound, there'll be a knockout rule where we can use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. Now, that was designed in a way which gives us the flexibility of a progressive Labour government coming to power to raise the resources we need, to have a long-term vision where we only borrow to invest, so therefore to grow the economy, but the flexibility that if we need it when monetary policy isn't working. I think that's the best way forward at the moment. There's a big discussion, which was MMT debate. Funnily enough, I met Bill Mitchell this morning for a cup of tea, and he had a bit of a wrangle with some of my advisors, and it was interesting to spectate, but there you are. But actually, his view is our fiscal rule is fine, but he thinks it's all right for a sunny day. What happens when the clouds darken? I think there's sufficient flexibility there to do it. The key player in the discussion was Simon Wren-Lewis, who, if you read some of his work, we've just published a book which I edited, and one of the early chapters is his. But also Joe Stiglitz was one of the key advisors on this, and his book about rewriting the rules of how you manage the economy is the one that stimulated most of all. So it was trying to get to a balanced approach which will enable people to give us the flexibility, but also give others, particularly international investors and others, the stability about our long-term future plans. I think it will work, and so far we've not had an awful lot of contestation with the people I've been meeting with about the fiscal rule itself. What's interesting is that under the Conservatives, they've had at least 3 fiscal rules that they've thrown out and junked. We could be the first government for a period that will abide by a fiscal rule, which could prove both progressive and stable in the long term.
Okay, I think we're going to draw the meeting to a close there. Jenny just wants to say a few words.
I really want to thank Carlos behind the camera, but everybody else for fantastic work for me. Thank you very much. And John for coming.